Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is National Taxpayers Union President Pete Sepp. He joins us today to respond to President Trump's vow to enact a middle-class tax cut sometime in the next 90 days. And Pete, thanks so much for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
President Trump making that vow in an interview with Maria Bartiromo from the Fox Business Network earlier this week when he was in Davos. First question, would this tax cut for the middle class he's talking about require new legislation, or are there triggers in the 2017 tax bill or somewhere else that he can enact?
There are a few things the president could do via executive order, but if we're talking about actually reducing tax rates further, either the income tax rate or perhaps the payroll tax rate, somehow that's going to have to involve Congress, and that might be a pretty tough environment for the president to confront. And of course, we have been here before. We have heard discussions time and again since probably mid-2018 that the administration was considering a second tax cut. Larry Kudlow, of course, who is the president's chief economic advisor, has been recently discussing the possibility of working the income tax system into something like the way it looked in 1986 and 87 when President Reagan signed tax reform and the absolute top tax rate was 28%. Currently, it's above 30%. So perhaps that's a direction he's thinking in. I would just point out, too, that when it comes to the federal income tax, it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually deliver middle-class tax relief because the middle class and certainly the working class and the working poor pay very little in income taxes currently. The average effective tax rate for a household making, say, $75,000 can be lower than 10%, depending on their overall economic and tax profile, whether they own a home or whether they decide to itemize or not, whether they have other write-offs. All of these things come into play, and increasingly the bigger burden on middle-class families is the payroll tax.
And we could talk about that in a moment as well. So, Pete, you mentioned that there are some things that can be done simply by executive order. Other things, as far as permanent tax rate reduction, certainly would have to go through Congress. And let's just be honest here. I mean, it's a Democratic House, so they're probably not inclined to do this in the first place. And even if they are, they certainly don't want to give the president a win like this in an election year. So the odds of this actually happening are?
Very low. I would give it below 20%. I won't blame them for trying, though, because having this discussion provides an important reminder to the American people of the progress we still have to make. Now, if there were a proposal that the president were willing to do through executive order, it would have to be something surrounding, I would say, capital gains and investment taxes. Now, how in the world can we tailor that to the middle class? I think there's a way. We have, for many years, discussed the ability of the executive branch to define how you declare a capital gain for tax purposes. In other words, the Treasury could be ordered to say, okay, from this point on, when you have a capital gain, you can take inflation into account before you pay taxes. That could be a big break for elderly investors who've held on to mutual funds or stocks for a number of years, real estate owners, perhaps people who might own a restaurant or a warehouse and are considering selling off the property and retiring. If you were able to say that you could reduce the capital gain that's subject to tax to account for the effect of inflation, and the Treasury were to simply order the IRS to create tax forms and whatnot to allow people to do that, that could be a pretty powerful tax cut for the folks in the middle class and the upper middle class who happen to have investments.
We're talking with Pete Sepp. He's the president of the National Taxpayers Union. And Pete, why not put this in the original bill a couple of years ago? Why wasn't this part of it?
I think a lot of it came down to the fact, number one, time certainly dwindled, even though the discussions over tax reform have been going on and on for a number of months. Really, Congress did not get down to serious legislating until about August or September of 2017. The bill was signed into law in December of 2017. So that was a problem. Another problem, I think, was trying to sort out wheat from chaff politically to see how many Democrats in the Senate might support the bill. It turns out none of them did. That was probably a futile effort. But there were also competing priorities to be fit within a certain budgetary target of revenues that were at stake. And I think they made a mistake by not using dynamic scoring with this capital gains proposal, because in the short term, at least, you would probably have a boost in revenues as people decided, well, hey, and now that I can take inflation into account and not have to pay tax on a phantom gain, I'm going to sell some of these stocks that I've been holding on to forever. That would result in a short-term revenue gain for the Treasury.
Pete, one of the things we heard constantly, and this is more of analysis of 2017 than what the president might be trying to push this year, but that these trillion-dollar deficits are close to it that we're seeing now are mainly a result of I told you so. The Republicans did these tax cuts and they couldn't pay for them. Other people, of course, I'm guessing you included, have said, no, this is a result of neither party being able to say no to spending.
Yes, it's certainly the spending side of the ledger that deserves a lot of the blame for our problems. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office will even say so. Yes, any time that you provide tax reductions, you will often see some kind of drop-off in revenues. But over the long term, you can also see improvements in economic growth that can offset that somewhat. Tax cuts don't necessarily pay for themselves, but they can be helpful if they're properly designed toward bringing in some revenues to offset the losses. It's the spending, though, this relentless trend among both Democrats and Republicans on defense spending, domestic spending, failure to act on reforming entitlements that is driving the deficit primarily. And until we address those structural issues, especially with Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlement programs, we are really barreling down the road toward a very serious fiscal reckoning. And this is no longer a generation away. We're talking about years, not decades.
Yes. Medicare insolvency is about half a decade away, maybe 6 years. I can't remember the exact forecast on that. But let's end on what I guess would be a happier note than financial cataclysm. And that would be what the economic impact would be if the president were to get his way on this. And I think I mean by that what he can do unilaterally here, since Congress is so unlikely to play ball.
I think the impact could be significant if he were to work with the Treasury in designing a way for people to take inflation into account when selling their investments for taxable purposes. Some of that would not show up until after the tax filing season of this year had been concluded. They'd really have to get a move on right now to enact something through executive order or guidance, because, of course, tax filing season is already starting. And time is going to be of the essence here. The 90-day pledge that the president made is certainly a good one. Whether he means that to be for legislative action or executive branch action, he's on the right track in noting that the days are slipping away, and the action has to occur very soon. And something has to be done about trade policy, which, of course, is levying the form of taxes on the American people with tariffs. That can't be helping the economy right now either.
And that, and middle class certainly affected by that as well. So, Pete, certainly a big promise and a specific promise. I guess we can check in towards the end of April and see where he is on this. Thanks very much for your analysis, as always.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too, sir. National Taxpayers Union President Pete Sepp. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.